Fort Liberty, North Carolina, March 2024. The instructor had been talking for 11 minutes when he stopped. Not the way people stop to find the right word or to check a slide or to take a drink of water. He stopped the way people stop when something becomes too important to rush. He set down the marker he was holding. He looked at the room. And then he said a sentence that had nothing to do with what he had been teaching for the past 11 minutes. He said it was something a British soldier had told him, more than 20 years ago. A man whose name he was not going to share, because that man had never asked for recognition, and it was not his place to offer it. What he would say was this, that in 23 years of service, across 3 combat theaters and more training cycles than he could count, no instructor, no general, no field manual, and no classified briefing had ever given him anything more useful than what that man said before walking out of Fort Bragg and getting on a plane back to the United Kingdom. He paused. "And I am aware," he said, "that no American officer should ever have to say that out loud." The room did not laugh. That is the beginning of this story. But the beginning of this story is not 2024. It is not Fort Liberty, and it is not a training room with fluorescent lights and a whiteboard covered in tactical diagrams. The beginning of this story is 2003. It is a smaller room, in a different building, on the same installation, when it still carried a different name. It is a group of men who believed, with complete justification, that they were the best trained special operations force in the world. They were not wrong. They had the budget to prove it. They had the kill counts to prove it. They had the technology, the selection pipeline, the institutional history, and the operational record to support every claim they had ever made about themselves. They had one thing they did not know they were missing. And the man who came to show them what it was arrived without ceremony, without a support staff, without a PowerPoint presentation, and without the faintest indication that he understood or cared what his presence was supposed to mean to the people waiting for him. He carried a Bergen, a notebook, and 19 years of a kind of experience that cannot be purchased, replicated, or simulated. His name does not appear in any public record connected to this program. What he said before he left does. This is the story of a staff sergeant from 22 SAS who arrived at Fort Bragg in the summer of 2003 with a Bergen, a notebook, and a set of orders that gave no indication of what he was actually there to do. He was not there to observe. He was not there to liaise. He was there to train. To take a group of Delta Force operators, men selected through one of the most demanding pipelines in the history of special operations, men who had already been to war and would go back to it, and teach them something they did not yet know they needed to learn. He had 6 weeks. He used every day of them. This is not a story about a British soldier who was better than the Americans. It is not a story about national pride, institutional rivalry, or the question of which flag produces better fighters. Those stories exist. This is not one of them. This is a story about a single idea, one concept, carried across the Atlantic in a notebook, field-tested across 19 years of operations in some of the most unforgiving environments a soldier can be placed in. And what happens when that idea collides with an institution that has every resource imaginable and one invisible gap running through the center of all of it? The staff sergeant did not know when he landed that what he was about to expose would take more than 2 decades to fully understand. He found out before he left. So did they. To understand what the staff sergeant walked into, you need to understand what Delta Force was in 2003. Not the mythology, not the films. The actual institutional reality of the unit at that specific moment in history. By the summer of 2003, 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta had been operational for 24 years. It had been built in the image of the SAS. That is not disputed, and the men inside the unit knew it. But it had long since evolved into something distinctly American in its scale, its funding, and its appetite for technological superiority. The selection pipeline ran candidates through weeks of land navigation, psychological evaluation, and physical attrition that eliminated the overwhelming majority of applicants. The men who passed were not ordinary soldiers who had been trained harder. They were a different category of person entirely, and the institution around them reflected that. The budget was classified. It remains partially classified today. But what is known from declassified JSOC procurement records and congressional oversight hearings is that by 2003, the per-operator equipment cost inside Delta had reached figures that would not have been credible a decade earlier. A single operator's personal kit, rifle system, optics, night vision, body armor, communications equipment, personal medical load, ran between $40,000 and $60,000. That number does not include vehicle assets, rotary wing support, intelligence feeds, or the infrastructure required to maintain persistent surveillance over a target package. It does not include the analysts. It does not include the satellites. It includes the man and what he carries on his body. The full operational apparatus supporting a Delta task force in Iraq in 2003, the drones, the AC-130 platforms, the signals intelligence architecture, the real-time feeds from NSA collection systems, the network of forward operating bases, the quick reaction forces on standby, ran to figures that had no equivalent anywhere else on Earth. No other nation was operating at that level. Few other nations could have matched it in scale, and none could have matched it consistently across multiple theaters. This was not arrogance, it was arithmetic, and it had produced real results. It had also trained men to trust the system that produced those results, which is what institutions do when the system works more often than it fails. The men inside that institution had built something that worked. They had the operational record to demonstrate it.
They had been to places that do not appear in official histories, and done things that will not be fully declassified within the lifetimes of the men who did them. When they lost someone, they felt it the way all soldiers feel it, completely and without remedy. When they succeeded, which was often, they did not celebrate. They planned the next operation. They were professionals in the fullest sense of the word.
And so when the word came down in the late spring of 2003 that a staff sergeant from the British SAS would be arriving to conduct a 6-week training program, the reaction inside the unit was not hostility. Hostility would have required a belief that there was something threatening about the arrangement. What it was patience, polite, disciplined, and almost entirely unconvinced. The SAS had a reputation that no one inside Delta would dismiss out loud. The shared history between the two units was real. The professional respect was genuine. But respect and the belief that an NCO from a foreign military, regardless of his pedigree, had something to teach men who had already been through the fire and come back with results, were two different things entirely. One sergeant major, whose name does not appear in any record connected to this program, was reported to have said, not in anger, but in the flat tone of a man stating an observable fact, that he was sure the British had useful things to share, and that the unit would give the program every professional courtesy it deserved. He said it the way you say something when you have already decided the outcome. He was not a bad soldier. He was not a closed mind. He was a man shaped by an institution that had given him every reason to trust its own methods, and no compelling reason yet to question them. That was about to change. In the summer of 2003, the problem in Iraq did not look like a problem from the inside. From the inside, it looked like a series of successes interrupted by circumstances outside anyone's control. The targets were real. The intelligence was processed. The operations were executed with a level of precision that no other force on Earth could have replicated. When Delta moved on a location, the mechanics of the assault were almost never the issue. The breaching, the clearing, the fire control, the casualty management, all of it performed at the level the institution had spent years building toward. The problem was what happened before the door came off the hinges. Not on every target, not in every district, not in every phase of the war, but often enough, and against the kind of targets that mattered most, to create a pattern that experienced operators could feel before anyone was prepared to formalize it on a whiteboard. The apparatus was not failing, it was doing exactly what it had been built to do. The difficulty was that the enemy had begun learning the rhythm of that apparatus, and rhythm is enough if you know how to survive inside it. In the 12 months between the fall of Baghdad in April 2003 and the summer of 2004, a pattern emerged in JSOC targeting data that was not classified exactly, but was not discussed openly either. It was the kind of pattern that lives in the space between what an institution knows and what it is prepared to say. Operations launched against high-value targets with full intelligence packages, Satellite imagery, signals intercepts, human source reporting, pattern of life analysis were returning without the primary objective at a rate that the resources deployed could not justify. The missions were not failures in the conventional sense. Compounds were cleared, fighters were killed or captured, weapons caches were documented. Every tactical metric that could be measured was performing within acceptable parameters. But the men at the top of the target list, the facilitators, the financiers, the network connectors who were keeping the insurgency supplied and organized, were consistently not there when the assault force arrived. 80 operators, predator coverage, AC-130 on station, Rangers on standby as a blocking force. Real-time feeds from collection platforms that cost more per flight hour than most countries spent on their entire air forces. Empty buildings. The debrief notes from this period, portions of which were reviewed in a 2009 internal JSOC assessment, describe a consistent sequence. Intelligence would develop a target package over a period of days or weeks. The package would be assessed, validated, and approved through a chain of command that involved multiple layers of analytical review. The operation would be planned in detail, rehearsed, and launched with full support. And somewhere between the validation of the intelligence and the moment the assault force hit the objective, the window would close. The targets were moving. They were moving with a frequency and an awareness of the surveillance architecture around them that should not have been possible given the resources being applied. They were not outrunning the technology. They were operating in the gaps between it, the minutes when a satellite passed out of coverage, the hours when a drone had to return for fuel, the brief intervals when a signals collection system shifted its focus. Gaps that existed in every surveillance architecture, no matter how well resourced. Gaps that, if you knew where they were, you could use. The men doing the analysis understood this in the abstract. They could map the coverage windows. They could see, in retrospect, that the timing of target movement correlated with the intervals in the surveillance schedule. But understanding something in retrospect and building an operational method that accounts for it in real time are not the same problem. The first is intelligence work. The second is something else. It is the ability to sit in silence for 18 hours in a position that provides observation on a target without satellite, without drone, without any of the collection infrastructure that the surveillance schedule depends on, and to do it with 4 men instead of 80, and a radio with a 3-kilometer range instead of a network of encrypted satellite communications. And to wait. Not impatiently. Not with a fixed timeline driven by the operational tempo of a task force that needs to cycle operators through rest and recovery. To wait the way the target waits. To operate inside the same constraints the target operates inside, because those constraints are not weaknesses. They are the conditions of the environment. Nobody inside the task force was framing the problem this way in 2003. Not because they were not intelligent, not because they were not experienced, but because the institution they operated inside had been built on a foundational assumption that resources reduce risk, that more technology means more certainty, that the solution to a problem of incomplete information is better information, more sensors, more analysts, more coverage, more bandwidth. The logic was not wrong. In most contexts, it was exactly right. In the specific context of a networked insurgency operating in a dense urban environment against a surveillance architecture with predictable coverage gaps, it was producing a result that the data was beginning to make very difficult to ignore. The numbers did not close. Nobody wanted to be the first to say why. That was the room the staff sergeant walked into. His name in the program records appears only as Staff Sergeant M, 22 SAS. No surname, no regimental number, no photograph attached to the file. What the file does contain is a service summary that takes less than half a page to describe 19 years of a career that most soldiers could not have survived, let alone built a methodology from. Northern Ireland, from the late 1980s through the mid-1990s, during the period when surveillance operations in South Armagh were producing casualty rates in the security forces that made the province the most dangerous operating environment in Europe for a British soldier. Bosnia, during the mid-1990s, in the period following Srebrenica when SAS teams were conducting close target reconnaissance in conditions where the rules of engagement were unclear, the political situation was deteriorating by the week. and the margin for error on any individual decision was effectively zero. Afghanistan, in the immediate aftermath of October 2001, in the early months when the intelligence picture was incomplete and the operating environment had not yet been mapped with any confidence by anyone. 19 years, 3 theaters, 1 notebook. The notebook is mentioned in 3 separate accounts from Delta operators who participated in the program. None of them describe its contents in detail, either because they were not shown those details or because what they saw was not in a form they could easily summarize. What they do describe, consistently, is the way he used it. He wrote in it every evening, not during the day, not between exercises, not in the moments when most instructors would be reviewing footage or updating assessment forms. In the evenings, alone, after the formal training day had ended. One operator, interviewed for an internal JSOC review in 2008, described passing the room the staff sergeant had been assigned and seeing the light still on past midnight on multiple occasions. He assumed the man was writing reports. He was not writing reports. He was writing observations. The program itself began on a Monday. By Wednesday, the operators who had been assigned to participate had developed a working consensus about what they were dealing with. The consensus was not unkind. It acknowledged, in the way that professionals acknowledge things they have already decided, that the staff sergeant was clearly experienced, clearly competent, and clearly operating from a doctrinal framework that had produced results in his operational context. The consensus also held, with equal clarity, that his operational context was not their operational context. The SAS worked in smaller teams with lighter support because that was what the British military could resource. Delta worked the way it worked because that was what the mission required and what the budget permitted. These were not equivalent situations. They were not entirely wrong about that. A troop-level surveillance mindset imported from one theater does not automatically survive contact with another, and nobody serious inside the unit believed otherwise. The skepticism was not childish. It was institutional, and institutions built under pressure rarely abandon a working method because a visitor tells them to. The staff sergeant did not appear to be aware of this consensus. On the 3rd day, he arrived at the training area at 05:30 with a list of changes to the program structure that had not been discussed in advance. The changes were not suggestions. They were adjustments, delivered in the flat tone of a man who had already decided what the next 3 weeks would look like. He removed the communication suite from every exercise. No encrypted radios, no satellite uplinks, no real-time feeds from the range's observation infrastructure. He removed the drone coverage that had been arranged as a standard training support asset. He reduced each training team from its standard composition of 12 operators to 4. The justification he offered was 11 words. I want to see what you can do with what you carry. The first exercise under the new parameters was a 48-hour surveillance task on a target building approximately 12 kilometers from the insertion point, through mixed terrain that included 2 kilometers of urban fringe on the approach. The task was to establish observation on the building, identify the pattern of movement of 3 designated personnel inside the target compound, and extract without detection. No drone. No radio beyond a short-range set with a 3-kilometer effective range. 4 men. Standard personal load. It was not a perfect replica of Iraq, and nobody present mistook it for one. It was a training problem designed to isolate a surveillance discipline problem, strip away habit, and make method visible. That mattered. The point was not to prove that 4 men were always better than 12. The point was to find out what 12 men had stopped noticing, once 12 men, a drone, and a full communications architecture became the default shape of every answer. The Delta teams completed the insertion without difficulty. The terrain presented no serious problem. The urban fringe was navigated without incident. They established their observation positions within the timeline the exercise required. Then, they waited. At the 31-hour mark, the first team was detected. Not by the opposing force role players, who were operating with realistic restrictions on their search patterns. By a pattern of life anomaly in their own behavior. A sequence of small, individually insignificant movements that, aggregated across 31 hours of observation by someone looking at the right data, formed a signature. The staff sergeant, reviewing the exercise from a separate observation post with no technological support beyond a pair of binoculars, had been tracking that signature from hour 4. The second team lasted 40 hours before making an error of a different kind. Not movement, but timing. They had established a communication rhythm on the short-range set that, while encrypted, was regular enough to be predicted. Regular enough that an adversary who understood the pattern could move in the intervals and rest in the windows. The staff sergeant had mapped the rhythm from the outside and demonstrated, in the debrief, exactly how it would have been exploited. None of this was presented as criticism. It was presented as data. Numbers, times, observable behaviors mapped against their consequences. The tone was the same tone he had used on the first day, flat, precise, and entirely without the performance of authority. He did not raise his voice. He did not express frustration. He described what he had seen with the same affect he might have used to read a weather report. The operators in the room were quiet in a way that was different from the quiet of the first 2 days. On the first 2 days, the quiet had been the quiet of people waiting for the material to become relevant to them. This was the quiet of people recalculating, because the staff sergeant had run the same exercise simultaneously. Alone. One man, same terrain, same target building, same 48-hour window, no radio, no drone, no support of any kind. He had established observation at hour 3. He had maintained it without confirmed detection for the full 48 hours. He had documented the pattern of movement of all 3 designated personnel. He had extracted without a recorded compromise in the opposing forces' logs. That did not mean he was superhuman. It meant he was doing one thing and only one thing: observation. He did not have to command a team, distribute sectors, or manage competing personalities inside a hide. The lesson was not that one man could replace 4. The lesson was that the extra bodies, the extra traffic, and the extra assumptions were creating signatures the teams had stopped feeling in their own bones. One man, 48 hours. 48 hours of doing something that the 4-man teams with full personal kit and institutional backing had not been able to sustain past 40 hours without producing a detectable pattern. Nobody laughed after day 3. What replaced the laughter was not admiration exactly. It was something more uncomfortable than admiration. It was the specific discomfort of a person who has built an expertise, had that expertise confirmed repeatedly by results, and then watch someone perform a version of the same task through a method so different from their own that the gap cannot be explained by talent or fitness or experience alone. The gap has to be somewhere in the method itself. And if it is in the method, then it was in the method before this week, which means it was in every operation run under that method, which means the results that confirmed the method were produced in spite of something, not because of everything. That is not a comfortable sequence of thoughts. The staff sergeant did not draw attention to it. He moved to the next exercise. He had 4 weeks left. The 5th week began on a Tuesday. The staff sergeant arrived at the briefing room at 600 and placed a single sheet of paper on the table. It contained the parameters of the final major exercise. No preamble, no explanation of the rationale. The parameters were the rationale: 2 teams, 1 exercise, 72 hours. Team 1, 4 operators, trained under the SAS methodology for the preceding 4 weeks. Personal load only, short-range radio, no drone support, no satellite feed, no QRF on standby. Team 2, 12 operators, full Delta Task Force configuration, encrypted communication suite, drone coverage arranged through the range support infrastructure, full personal kit, every asset that a standard operational package would include. The objective was identical for both teams. Penetrate a designated target area covering approximately 6 square kilometers of mixed terrain, locate and establish confirmed observation on 3 separate target individuals operating within that area, document their pattern of movement over the 72-hour window, and extract without triggering any of the 31 detection markers the exercise controllers had seeded across the operational environment. Detection markers included physical tripwires on likely approach routes, role-player patrols operating on randomized schedules, remote sensor packages placed at the 4 most logical observation positions, and a dedicated opposing force intelligence cell that was running its own pattern of life analysis on both teams from the moment of insertion. The staff sergeant would not be participating in the exercise. He would be observing from a position outside the operational area with a notebook and a pair of binoculars. The insertion began at 2100 hours on Tuesday. Team 2 moved efficiently. 12 men with the kind of operational experience that does not need to be reminded of its own competence. They navigated the first 2 kilometers inside the timeline without difficulty, avoided the most obvious sensor positions on the eastern approach, and established their first observation post by 01:30 Wednesday. The drone was overhead by 0200, feeding real-time imagery to the communications sergeant, who was cross-referencing target movement against the pattern of life data developed in the pre-mission analysis package. By dawn on Wednesday, they had confirmed the location of 2 of the 3 target individuals. At 0847 Wednesday morning, the opposing force intelligence cell noted an anomaly in the drone's flight pattern. The aircraft had been flying a holding orbit that, over the course of 6 hours, had established a predictable geometric relationship to the observation post below it. The orbit was tight enough to be efficient and wide enough not to be obvious, but regular enough that the cell's analyst, a role player who had been given the specific task of watching for surveillance signatures rather than looking for the teams directly, had been able to reverse engineer the observation post's probable location within a 90-meter radius by tracking the orbit's center of gravity. By 0930, the opposing force had walked a patrol to within 40 meters of the observation post. Team 2 collapsed the position and moved. They were professionals. The movement was clean, fast, and executed without the kind of noise that would have triggered a direct compromise. But moving a 12-man element with a full communications load through mixed terrain in daylight away from a position that had just been identified generates a signature. Not a loud one, not an obvious one, but a real one. The intelligence cell logged it at 10:14. At 13:40 Wednesday, the drone had to return to the forward area for a battery exchange. The gap was 11 minutes. The 11 minutes were logged. Target 2 moved during that window. By Wednesday evening, Team 2 had re-established observation on 2 of the 3 target individuals, lost and relocated one of them twice, triggered 2 of the 31 detection markers, neither of them critical, both of them logged, and was operating on a communications cycle that the intelligence cell had begun tracking with enough confidence to brief a predicted next transmission window. At 03:15 Thursday morning, they triggered a 3rd detection marker. This one was physical. A tripwire on a re-entry route that the team had not used on the insertion, had not scouted on approach, and had crossed because the alternative routing added 40 minutes to a movement that needed to stay inside a tighter window. The decision was reasonable. The outcome was a logged compromise that, in an operational context, would have altered the adversary's alert status. 71 hours into the exercise, Team 2 had confirmed observation on 2 of 3 targets, generated a continuous detectable signature from hour 6 onward, triggered 3 detection markers, and not yet identified the 3rd target individual's pattern of movement with sufficient confidence to report. Team 1 had inserted at the same time, through the same entry point, into the same operational area. They were not detected at hour 6, or hour 12, or hour 24. At no point during the 72 hours did the opposing force intelligence cell log a confirmed signature for Team 1. The drone did not identify them. The sensor packages did not register them. The role-player patrols walked within 30 meters of their 2nd observation post on Thursday afternoon and logged nothing. The detection markers remained untriggered. That does not mean Team 1 moved through the area like ghosts. It means nothing. They did cross the threshold from suspicion to confirmation. There is a difference, and soldiers who spend enough time under observation learn to live inside it. By the time the exercise window closed at 2100 Thursday, Team 1 had documented the confirmed pattern of movement of all 3 target individuals. They had done it across 4 separate observation positions, moving between them in windows that the drone coverage schedule left unmonitored. At times, the role-player patrols were not where the patrols had been the previous night, because the patrols operated on randomized schedules, and the only way to know where they would not be was to have watched where they had been long enough to understand the randomization parameters. 4 men. No drone, no satellite, no real-time intelligence feed. 72 hours. Every objective completed. 0 detection markers triggered. 0 confirmed signatures in the opposing force logs. Not perfection. Just discipline applied hard enough and early enough that the environment never got a clean read on them. Team 2 returned to the briefing room at 21:15. Team 1 returned at 2128. The exercise controllers took 13 minutes to compile the initial results sheet. The debrief began at 2200. The staff sergeant placed the results sheet on the table without comment. He sat down. He did not begin speaking. The room was silent for 4 minutes. Not the silence of men waiting for someone else to speak first. The silence of men sitting with something they have just understood for the first time, and not yet having decided what to do with the understanding. Nobody was the first to speak. Eventually, the staff sergeant picked up his notebook, opened it to a page near the back, and said that he had 1 week remaining and that they should make use of it. Nobody disagreed. The staff sergeant left Fort Bragg on a Friday morning in late July 2003. No ceremony, no formal closeout parade, no unit coin pressed into his hand by a commanding officer in front of assembled personnel. He signed the administrative paperwork that the program required, returned the access badge that had given him entry to the training facilities for 6 weeks, and was driven to the airport by a staff driver who, by all available accounts, did not know what the man sitting in the passenger seat had just spent 6 weeks doing. He carried the same Bergen he had arrived with. The notebook went with him. What stayed behind was harder to quantify. In the 12 months that followed, 3 Delta Force teams that had participated in the program and continued to apply elements of the methodology in their operational cycle returned to Iraq and worked against high-value targets in the Baghdad and Mosul operational areas. What happened in that 12-month window appears in a late 2004 JSOC assessment, later referenced during a broader Special Operations Effectiveness Review, with portions of the underlying material entering limited public view years afterward. The language around those documents is careful, and it should be. Units were adapting on several fronts at once, and no serious after-action process treats war like a laboratory. What can be said with confidence is narrower than legend and stronger than rumor. Several teams altered the way they handled reconnaissance, observation and communications discipline before target action, and those changes coincided with better closure on certain target packages. The numbers in that assessment are specific. Across the period from August 2003 to August 2004, the 3 teams operating with modified methodology, reduced team sizes on reconnaissance phases, communications discipline modeled on the program parameters, extended observation windows without drone support on the final 48 hours before a target move, recorded a combined high-value target capture rate that the assessment described as significantly above the historical unit average for comparable target packages. The assessment does not give a precise percentage. What it gives is a comparative frame. In the preceding 12 months, the task force as a whole had closed approximately 1 in 3 high-value target operations with the primary objective in custody or confirmed dead. In the 12 months following, the 3 teams applying the modified approach closed at a rate the assessment characterized as materially higher, without a corresponding increase in resources, personnel, or operational support. This was not a controlled experiment. The 2004 assessment is careful about that. The broader JSOC operational approach was evolving during the same period. General Stanley McChrystal's transformation of the task force, the acceleration of the targeting cycle, the integration of intelligence and operations into a single continuous loop, the shift toward a network degradation model rather than a target-by-target approach, was underway and beginning to produce its own effects. Attributing results to any single variable in that environment was not analytically sound, and the assessment does not attempt it. What the assessment does say, in language that is precise in the way that internal military documents are precise when they are trying to say something without saying it directly, is that the training program conducted by the attached British SAS Instructor in the summer of 2003 was the clearest, discrete training influence visible in the operational behavior of the teams that received it during the review period. Not a change in their tactical competence, which was already at the highest level the institution could produce. A change in their operational patience, their willingness to compress the team, extend the timeline, remove the technology when the target set justified it, and sit inside the environment rather than above it. The document was classified at the time of its completion. It remained classified for 7 years. In 2010, when portions were released as part of a broader special operations review, a serving general officer within JSOC, whose name is redacted in the public version of the document, provided a written assessment of the program's legacy that was included as an annex. The language in that annex does not read like the language of a man performing an administrative function. It reads like the language of a man who had been thinking about something for 7 years and had finally been given a formal occasion to say it. He wrote that the program had demonstrated, with more clarity than any simulation or theoretical framework the command had applied to the problem, that the single most expensive gap in the unit's operational methodology was not technological. It was not a question of sensors, or platforms, or processing capacity. It was a question of what an operator did when all of those things were removed, whether the discipline remained, whether the patience held, whether the man inside the equipment was capable of functioning without it. He wrote that the program had answered that question. He wrote that the answer had been instructive. And then, in the final line of the annex, in a document produced by one of the most powerful special operations commands in the history of modern warfare, he wrote in substance that 6 weeks with one British NCO had yielded a sharper operational return than any formal training intervention the command had run in the preceding 4 years. 6 weeks. 1 man. 1 notebook. 6 weeks against 20 years of established doctrine. 4 men against 12. 1 notebook against a surveillance architecture that cost more per operational day than most countries spent on their entire defense budgets in a month. A single training program, run without fanfare, without institutional announcement, without a line in any public record that connected a name to what had been built inside those 6 weeks, set against the formal training investments the command had made in the 4 years surrounding it. The staff sergeant's name did not appear in any press release. No unit citation carried his contribution. No official handover ceremony placed his methodology into the institutional record with the kind of formal acknowledgement that would have made it traceable to a person rather than an idea. Within the chain of command, the people who needed to know what had happened knew. Outside of it, the program did not exist in any form that a researcher, a journalist, or a foreign intelligence service could locate and map. That was not an accident. But before the staff driver pulled away from the curb on that Friday morning in late July 2003, something happened that was not in the administrative record either. A lieutenant colonel from the unit, one of the senior officers who had observed portions of the program without participating directly, walked out to the vehicle before it left. He had one question. Not about the methodology, not about the exercises or the results, or the practical application of the doctrine to the operational environment in Iraq. He had watched 6 weeks of a man systematically dismantle assumptions that the institution had treated as certainties, and he wanted to know what the staff sergeant considered the central principle of everything he had taught, the thing underneath the exercises, the idea the methodology was actually built on. The staff sergeant looked at him for a moment, then he said it. 1 sentence. Not about tactics. Not about team size or communications discipline or the management of surveillance signatures. About something older than any of those things. About the quality that separates an operator who is technically proficient from one who is genuinely dangerous. Not because of what he carries or what is flying above him or what the intelligence architecture has told him in the last 10 minutes, but because of what he knows about time. About the difference between enduring a moment and understanding it. About the discipline of not moving until the movement means something. Patience is not waiting. Patience is knowing exactly what you are waiting for. The vehicle left. The lieutenant colonel stood there for a moment, then turned and walked back inside. 21 years later, in a training room at Fort Liberty that the man who said that sentence has never entered and will likely never enter, an instructor paused in the middle of a lesson and repeated it to a new generation of operators who had never heard the name of the man it came from. They did not need to. The idea arrived intact.